The summer of 1887 came to Willow Bend, Texas, like a judgment that had been a long time forming. The heat arrived first, settling over the town like a wool blanket, soaked in kerosene, pressing down on every roof and every soul beneath it. The main street baked in silence most mornings. Horses stood at their hitching posts with their heads down and their eyes half closed, too drained to bother with the flies crawling across their flanks. The few people who had business on the street moved quickly and without conversation, ducking back into whatever shade they could find. Even the wind had given up. It had stopped somewhere out on the plains and not bothered to continue. Willow Bend was not a large town. It was not a prosperous town. It sat at the edge of a valley, like something that had been placed there temporarily and then forgotten about a single main street with false-fronted buildings that leaned slightly in different directions. A church at the north end with a bell that only rang on Sundays, a saloon at the south end that rang considerably more often. Between them were the usual arrangements of a frontier settlement, a blacksmith, a feed store, a telegraph office, a barber shop that also pulled teeth, and Rupert Gann's general store, which smelled of tobacco and leather, and the particular sweetness of hard candy kept too long in glass jars. A stranger had been in town for 3 days. He sat at the same corner table in May Whitfield's eating house every morning in the chair that put his back against the wall and his eyes on the street. He arrived before anyone else, and he left after the coffee went cold. He ordered the same thing each time, eggs, black coffee, no conversation, and he paid with exact change pulled from the breast pocket of a coat that had seen considerably more miles than the man wearing it deserved to survive. He was not a young man. Anyone who looked at him knew that immediately. His hair had gone the color of old pewter, thick still but silver all the way through. And it hung to his collar beneath a hat that bore the particular dents and stains of something used in earnest for a very long time. His face was the kind of face that comes from decades of weather and trouble, scored with deep lines around the eyes and across the forehead. A jaw that had been broken once and set slightly wrong. A nose that had been broken twice and set not at all. His hands, when they rested on the table around his coffee cup, were large and scarred across the knuckles, the kind of hands that had done hard work and harder things. He was 62 years old. His name was Elias Cord. He had ridden into Willow Bend on a Monday morning on a gray gelding named Amos, who was 15 years old and moved with the dignified patience of a horse who had earned the right to take things at his own pace. They had come from the north, down through the flat country above the Red River, and before that, from a dozen other places across a dozen other years, and before all of that from a life in Colorado that no longer existed in any form that Elias Cord recognized. He had not come to Willow Bend by accident. He had been looking for this town for the better part of 2 years. Before that, he had been looking for a man in Kansas. And before Kansas, it had been New Mexico, and before New Mexico, it had been 3 different places in Colorado. And in each of those places he had arrived to find that the man he was looking for had already moved on, already changed his name, already planted himself in new soil and begun the slow, patient work of making himself untouchable. The man's name, as of 5 years ago, was Magnus Greer. He owned a ranch to the east of town called Iron Mesa, which covered 11,000 acres of the best grazing land in that part of Texas and was still growing. He had arrived in Willow Bend in 1882 with money that no one questioned the origins of and a manner that invited no questions. He had bought land, and then more land, and when the selling was not voluntary, he had found other methods, and gradually the valley around Willow Bend had become his in all the ways that mattered, and several that did not, strictly speaking, fall within the boundaries of the law. The sheriff's name was Lyle Pike. Pike worked for Greer. Everyone in Willow Bend knew this, the same way they knew the sun would come up in the morning and the creek ran dry in August. They knew it, and they did not say it because saying it had consequences, and the people of Willow Bend had learned over 5 years what those consequences looked like. Elias Cord knew all of this because he had spent 3 days watching and listening. He had drunk bad coffee and watched the street and listened to the men at nearby tables talk in the careful, abbreviated way of people who have learned that certain subjects are not safe. He had noted the comings and goings of the men who wore iron mesa brands on their horses and the particular flat expression of those who worked for Greer directly. He had walked the perimeter of the town on foot slowly, like a man with nowhere to be, and had identified the roads in and out, the angles of cover, the places where a man could be seen, and the places where he could not. He had confirmed with his own eyes on the second evening that Magnus Greer was indeed the man he had been looking for. The man he had known 12 years ago under a different name. The man who had killed his son. Elias sat with that knowledge, the way he had learned to sit with it over the years, which was carefully the way you sit near a fire when the wind is unpredictable. He did not allow himself to feel it too directly. He had learned that anger was a fuel that burned fast and hot, and left you empty at exactly the moment you needed to be sharp. He kept it banked, controlled, useful. He had been keeping it that way for 12 years, and he had gotten very good at it. What he needed was evidence. He had plenty of memory. 12 years of memory, in fact, sharp-edged and detailed in the way that things are when they are the worst things that have ever happened to you. He remembered the ride up into the mountains above Copper Ridge, Colorado, in the winter of 1875, the smoke visible from 3 miles out, the particular quality of silence that followed a fire when there is no one left to make sound. He remembered the graves he had dug himself in frozen ground with his bare hands, because he could not find a shovel in the wreckage, and the words he had said over them because there was no one else to say them. He remembered the weeks after when he had gone to the Pinkerton office in Denver with everything he knew, every name and date and piece of evidence he had managed to gather. And he remembered the look on the regional director's face, which was not the look of a man who intended to pursue justice. It was the look of a man who had already made a different arrangement. He had been with the Pinkertons for 27 years. He had been one of their best men. It had not mattered. They had closed the file on Jesse Cord's death on a Wednesday in February of 1875. They had called it an accident. They had suggested with carefully chosen words that Elias was allowing grief to distort his judgment. They had offered him a leave of absence. He had not taken it. He had instead been escorted from the building by 2 men who had once been his colleagues, and told that his services were no longer required, and that further pursuit of the Harlan Moss matter would be considered interference with a closed investigation. Harlan Moss. That was the name Magnus Greer had used in Colorado. Before Colorado, he had used 2 other names, both of which Elias had traced back through land records and bank documents and the memories of people who had reason to remember. The names changed. The methods did not. Land, water rights, pressure, and then more than pressure. Men who stood in the way of what he wanted had a habit of meeting with misfortune. Jesse had stood in his way. Jesse had been 24 years old, broad-shouldered and serious-eyed in the way that young men are when they have decided what they believe in and are not yet old enough to know how much that costs. He had been a deputy in Copper Ridge for 2 years, good at the work, liked by people who liked honest men, which was fewer people than it should have been. He had started asking questions about the deaths of 2 ranchers whose land Harlan Moss had subsequently acquired, and the questions had been the right questions asked in the right order. And someone had told Moss that a young deputy was getting close to something. Jesse had been found at the bottom of a ravine 8 miles from town. The official determination was that his horse had thrown him. His horse was found grazing peacefully 300 yards away, unhurt, still saddled. Nobody in Copper Ridge with any authority over anything had pursued the discrepancy. Elias Cord had pursued nothing else since. He was thinking about Jesse, as he often did in the early morning, when the coffee was still hot enough to be worth drinking, when the bell above the door of Rupert Gann's general store rang across the street, and 3 men walked in. He recognized them. Tuck Vardell was the one in the middle, broad and slow-moving the way dangerous men sometimes are, with a face that looked like it had been arranged by someone who did not particularly like faces. Vardell was Greer's right hand, his enforcer, the man who translated what Greer wanted into something that could be accomplished through violence or the credible threat of it. The 2 men flanking him were younger and meaner-looking in the specific way of men who had not yet learned that being mean is not the same as being capable. Elias watched through the window. He could not hear what was being said. He could see Rupert Gann behind his counter, an old man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who had been running that store since before Willow Bend had a name for itself, standing very still with his hands gripping the edge of the counter and his face the color of old ash. He could see the young woman who had been in the store when Vardell and his men walked in. She was standing with her back against a shelf of canned goods. Her chin level, her hands at her sides, not flinching but not advancing either. The particular stillness of someone who has learned to hold themselves together in situations that warranted falling apart. He had seen her before. He had made it his business over 3 days to know the faces of everyone who came and went in this town. She was Ada Hale, the widow of Robert Hale, who had owned 400 acres on the western edge of the valley and had died 8 months ago in what had been described as a well accident. She came into town twice a week for supplies. She rode alone and she carried herself the way people do when they are very tired, but have decided that showing it is not an option they can afford. Vardell grabbed her wrist. Elias Cord put down his coffee cup. He did not hurry across the street. Hurrying at 62 with a left knee that had been shot through 15 years ago and healed imperfectly was not something he did without reason, and he had learned over a long career that a man who enters a situation at a run has already told everyone in the room something about his state of mind that he might prefer to keep to himself. He walked at the pace of a man with somewhere to be and enough experience to know he will get there. The bell above the door rang. The 3 men turned. The light came in behind him strong and white, the way Texas morning light is in the summer. And for a moment he was just a shape in a doorway, a silhouette in a coat that had seen too many miles. Then he stepped forward, and they saw him clearly. Vardell looked at him the way men like Vardell always looked at old men, with a particular kind of contempt that comes from measuring everything by the surface and finding the surface unpromising. He saw the silver hair and the lined face and the slight forward lean of a man whose back had been arguing with him for years, and he made a calculation that seemed to him to be correct and was not. He said something about the store being closed. Elias looked at him. Then he looked at Ada. She was watching him with eyes that were dark and careful and had clearly seen enough of the world to not take help for granted. Her wrist was still in Vardell's grip. A bruise was already forming. He looked back at Vardell. He drew. Not quickly in the way that word is usually meant, not the theatrical blur of a young man with something to prove. He drew the way he had drawn for 30 years, which was smoothly and without wasted motion and without any part of his body telegraphing what was about to happen until it had already happened. The barrel of his Colt came to rest against the center of Tuck Vardell's forehead in the space between one breath and the next. Vardell's hand released Ada's wrist. The 2 younger men had their hands on their guns. They did not draw. They were looking at their employer's face, which had gone the particular color that faces go when a piece of cold steel is pressed firmly against the bone above the nose. And they were doing the arithmetic that soldiers and hired men always do in those moments, and the arithmetic was not coming out in favor of action. Elias's voice when he spoke was the voice he used for everything level and deliberate, the voice of a man who had said difficult things so many times that the difficulty had long since worn smooth. "I've buried faster men than you, son," he said to Vardell. "Don't make me prove it." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Then he said, without looking away from Vardell, "Ma'am, walk past me. Go to your horse. I'll be right behind you." Ada Hale moved. Her boots were steady on the wooden floor. She passed Elias and passed through the door and into the white light of the morning without running, without looking back, which told him something about her that he filed away for later consideration. He held the position for 3 more seconds, long enough to let everyone in the room understand that he was leaving because he chose to, not because they were allowing it. Then he stepped back through the door, still facing the room, and pulled it closed behind him. Ada was at her horse. A bay mare, old but solid, hitched at the post outside the store. She was not trembling. She was watching him with that same careful attention. He untied Amos from the next post, down swung up into the saddle with the unhurried deliberation of a man who has done it 10,000 times, and they rode north out of the main street without speaking. They were half a mile out of town in the shade of a stand of mesquite that grew along the creek bed before she said anything. "You should know," she said, "that you just made an enemy. Had enemies before. Not like Magnus Greer." He looked at her. "Tell me about your land." She did. 412 acres, according to the deed her father had filed in 1861 before the war changed everything. Good land with a spring-fed creek that ran year-round even in the driest summers, which in that part of Texas made it worth considerably more than its size suggested. Her husband, Robert, had worked it alone for 7 years, and for the last 8 months she had worked it alone with 2 aging ranch hands who had stayed on out of loyalty and a herd of 25 cattle that was not growing fast enough to outrun the debt she had inherited along with the land. Greer had sent his first offer 6 weeks after Robert's funeral. She had declined. 3 more offers had followed, each lower than the last, and after the 4th she had received a visit from Vardell instead of a letter. "He wants the creek," Elias said. "The water rights." She looked at him steadily. "How do you know that?" "Because it's what he's always wanted." He paused. "What do you know about how your husband died?" The question was direct, in a way that clearly cost her something to receive. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed slightly, not weaker but more careful, like a woman carrying something fragile across uneven ground. "The well was old," she said. "The boards over the top had been rotting for 2 seasons. Robert kept meaning to replace them." She stopped. "Sheriff Pike said it was an accident, said he'd seen it before." "And you?" Ada Halle turned and looked at him fully, and there was something in her expression that had nothing to do with uncertainty. "Robert was the most careful man I ever knew," she said. "He replaced those boards 6 weeks before he died. I watched him do it." Elias nodded. He did not say anything immediately. He let the information settle into its proper place alongside everything else he knew about Magnus Greer and the way he operated. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I'm in Willow Bend." He told her. He had not told anyone in 12 years, not the full version, not all of it. He had given pieces to various lawmen and investigators over the years, edited versions calibrated to get a specific response, the version most likely to result in help or information. He had not told anyone the whole truth because the whole truth was not a strategic document, it was just what had happened. He told Ada Hale. He told her about Jesse, about Copper Ridge, about the winter of 1875, and the smoke he had seen from 3 miles out. He told her about the Pinkerton file being closed and the man who had done it and what he suspected that man had been paid. He told her about 12 years of following a trail through Kansas and New Mexico and back into Colorado and eventually into Texas, following a man who changed his name, like other men changed their coats, always staying 1 step behind, never quite catching up. He told her that Magnus Greer was born Harlan Moss. He told her that the man who had made her a widow was the same man who had made him a father without a son. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. The creek moved past them with the slow patience of water that has been moving through this particular geography since before either of them was born. "He killed Robert," she said. It was not a question. It was a woman arriving at a conclusion she had been approaching for 8 months, and finally allowing herself to reach it. "I believe so." "And you came here to do what exactly?" "To get evidence," he said. "Enough to take to someone with actual authority. A federal marshal, someone outside Greer's reach." He paused. "I've been doing this long enough to know that killing him isn't enough. He has lawyers and judges in his pocket up and down this part of Texas. I kill him, I hang. His operation continues under the next man in line." He looked out toward the horizon, toward the flat shimmer of the heat. "I want it to end, all of it. The land grabbing and the killing and the way these towns just let it happen because they don't think they have a choice." Ada was quiet for a moment more. Then she said, "You can't do that alone." "No," he agreed. "I can't." She looked at him for a long time. He had the sense of being assessed by someone who did not make assessments carelessly. "There's a bunkhouse," she said finally. "Hasn't got much, but it's got a roof and a bed." That's more than I've had some nights. Room and board, she said. Nothing more. I can't pay wages. Didn't ask for wages. She nodded once the way people nod when a decision has been made and they intend to live with it. Then she turned her mare north toward the ranch, and Elias turned Amos to follow. The Hale Ranch came into view 20 minutes later, and Elias looked at it the way he had learned over decades to look at things all of it at once, taking inventory. The main house was a solid structure, 2 stories built from timber that had been here a while and had settled into the land properly. The paint was weathering, but the foundation was good. A barn stood to the west, functional but in need of attention on the roof and the east-facing wall. A corral with decent fencing, an empty paddock, a chicken coop that was active judging by the sounds coming from it. A windmill that had a slight wobble in the way it turned. The spring-fed creek ran along the southern boundary, visible as a darker line of vegetation against the dry grass, green and insistent even in the August heat. He understood immediately why Greer wanted this land. Could be worse, he said. Ada looked at him sideways. It could, he said again, and swung down from the saddle. He worked that afternoon on the barn roof, which had 3 places where the boards had split and would not hold against a hard rain. He worked methodically, pulling bad boards and fitting new ones from the pile of lumber stacked behind the barn, moving at the pace that a 62-year-old man with a bad knee and an old shoulder moves when there is work that needs doing. Deliberately, without wasted motion. Ada brought water twice and watched him work with the expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. You've done this before, she said, not the roof. She meant all of it. Building things or fixing them, both. My father had a place in Indiana, he said, driving a nail. Before the war, before I went west. You learn it young enough it doesn't leave you. He worked until the light failed. The barn roof was sound. He ate the supper. Ada set out beans and cornbread and a piece of salt pork at the kitchen table while she sat across from him with her own plate, and they talked about practical things. The state of the herd. The payment due to the bank in October, the 2 ranch hands named Duff and Cornelius, who came in for breakfast and went out to work and said little but seemed solid. He did not talk about Jesse that first night, or the second. On the 3rd night he came in from the corrals, where he had spent 2 hours rehanging a gate that had been sagging for months, and Ada was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and she handed him one without speaking, and they sat in the chairs that faced west, where the last of the light was fading into deep orange above the plains. After a while she said, "Tell me about your son." He did not answer immediately. He turned the cup in his hands. He looked at the place where the sun had been. Then he told her about Jesse. He did not tell it the way he had told her the facts earlier. The timeline, the events. He told it the way you tell something when you are finally telling it to someone who is not going to use it as evidence or a report or a tactical advantage. He told her about the way Jesse had laughed, which was with his whole face, the way his mother had laughed before she died. He told her about the morning Jesse had ridden out of Denver, heading for Copper Ridge, the morning Elias had watched him go from the doorway of the Pinkerton office, and had thought, as fathers think about all the things that could go wrong, and dismissed them the way you dismiss thoughts that are true, but unbearable. He told her about the letters Jesse had sent. 3 of them over the 2 months he had been in Copper Ridge, careful letters in the precise handwriting of a young man who had taught himself to write as an adult. The last one had talked about the 2 ranchers, about the pattern he was seeing in the land transfers, about a man named Harlan Moss, who owned the mining operation to the north of town and was expanding faster than honest money allowed. He had never received a 4th letter. Ada listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked out at the dock for a long time. Then she said quietly, Robert kept a journal. He'd kept one for years. After the 4th time Greer's men came to the property, he started writing down dates and names, things he'd seen, things he'd heard. She paused. I couldn't find it after he died. Greer's men were through the house the day of the funeral. I know they took it. Elias looked at her. He knew something, she said. Robert wasn't a man who wrote things down unless they mattered. It'll be in the safe at Iron Mesa, Elias said. It was not a guess. It was the conclusion of a man who had spent 12 years learning how Harlan Moss operated. He kept things. He kept evidence of what he had done, not out of sentiment, but out of the particular security that comes from having something over everyone you have ever dealt with. Along with everything else he doesn't want anyone to find. Ada was quiet again. The night had settled fully around them, big and dark and full of the sounds of insects and the distant movement of cattle. "You're planning to go in there," she said, "when the time is right." She turned and looked at him. In the dark, with the lantern light from the kitchen window behind her, he could not see her expression clearly, but her voice, when she spoke, was the voice of someone who has made another decision. "Then we need to be ready," she said, "before the time is right, because when Vardel reports back to Greer about what happened today, and the clock starts moving." Elias nodded slowly. He had known that since the moment he walked into Rupert Gann's store. They finished their coffee. The night was large around them, and the stars were out in the full abundance of a Texas sky with no competing light for 50 miles in any direction. The windmill turned with its slight wobble, a sound like a hesitation repeated at regular intervals. From the pasture, the cattle moved with their quiet nighttime sounds. He was turning to go inside when they heard the hoofbeats, 5 horses coming fast from the direction of the main road. Before the sound had fully resolved into its proper shape, Elias had his hand on his gun, and Ada had stepped back into the shadow of the doorway. Tuck Vardel pulled up at the gate with 4 men behind him, and in the torchlight from the nearest post, his face wore the expression of a man who has been given an instruction and intends to deliver it with interest. "Evening," Vardel called. His voice carried the careful pleasantness of a man who was not being pleasant. "Mr. Greer wanted you to have a message, Mrs. Hale." Elias stepped off the porch and into the yard. He moved without hurrying, crossing the distance between the porch and the gate with the same deliberate pace he used for everything, and he stopped where the light was enough for Vardel to see him clearly. He watched Vardel's eyes find him and adjust. "Cord," Vardel said, not quite a greeting. "Vardel," the same tone, the same weight. "You should have kept riding." "People keep telling me that." Vardel's jaw tightened. He looked at Ada, then back at Elias. "Mr. Greer is offering a fair price. Generous, even given the state of things. Mrs. Hale has 48 hours to sign the papers or make other arrangements." He paused to let the shape of those other arrangements suggest themselves. "After that, Mr. Greer can't be responsible for what happens to property in this valley." Elias was quiet for a moment. He let the silence work on the 5 men at the gate, the way silence works on men who are accustomed to their threats landing immediately. Then he said, "Tell Mr. Greer something for me." Vardel waited. "Tell him Elias Cord sends his regards." He let that land. "Tell him I remember Colorado. Tell him I remember Copper Ridge." He paused once more. "Tell him I've been patient for 12 years, and I'm nearly done being patient." Vardel did not move for a long moment. Something had changed in his face, some calculation working itself out behind his eyes, a reassessment of the situation he had ridden into. The name had done something. Elias could see it clearly. The flicker, the recalibration, the expression of a man receiving information that required him to update what he thought he knew. Then Vardel pulled his horse around without another word, and the 4 men with him fell in behind, and they rode back toward Iron Mesa in the dark. Ada came to stand beside him at the gate. "He knew the name," she said. "Greer will know it too," Elias said. "By morning." "Is that a problem?" He considered the question honestly. "It changes the timing," he said. "But it also changes what Greer knows about what I know. A man who's afraid of being exposed makes different choices than a man who thinks he's untouchable." He looked at her. "We needed him to move. Now he'll move." Ada was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll make more coffee. It'll go cold. Then we'll drink it cold," she said, and went inside. Elias stayed at the gate a moment longer. He looked east toward Iron Mesa, toward the dark bulk of the land that Harlan Moss had built over 15 years of other people's ruin. He thought about Jesse. He thought about the letters and the last one and the things Jesse had written about a pattern he was seeing about a man expanding faster than honest money allowed. He thought about what Jesse would say if he could see this moment. Jesse had always been the more patient of the two of them, the one who trusted that things would come out right if you stayed with him long enough. Elias had been the one who chafed at patience, who had to remind himself daily that moving before the evidence was ready was the same as not moving at all. 12 years had taught him patience he had not possessed when Jesse was alive. He turned and went inside where the lamp was burning, and the coffee was hot for the moment, and the work of what came next was waiting to be planned. The night after Vardel's visit, Elias Cord did not sleep. This was not unusual. Sleep had become over the past 12 years something he negotiated with rather than something he could count on. He would lie down and close his eyes, and sometimes the darkness behind them was just darkness. And sometimes it was the slope of a mountain in Colorado with smoke rising from the bottom of a ravine, and he had learned to tell the difference in the first few seconds and to get up when it was the second kind, because lying in the dark with that particular image was not rest by any reasonable definition of the word. He sat on the step of the bunkhouse with his back against the doorframe and his gun across his knees and watched the night. The sky above the Texas plain was enormous, the way it always was out here, more sky than a man from the east could comfortably account for, scattered with stars so dense in places they looked like something spilled rather than something placed. The ranch was quiet. The cattle were settled. The windmill turned with its slight wobble, a sound like a hesitation repeated at regular intervals. He thought about Vardel's face when he had said the name. A man who had no reason to know that name would have shown nothing. Vardel had shown something, a flicker, a recalibration, the momentary expression of a man receiving information that required him to update what he thought he knew. Greer had told his people enough about the past to make them careful about certain things, which meant Greer was still afraid of the past. 12 years was a long time to be afraid of something, but Elias understood it. He had been living alongside his own fears for 12 years too, and they had not diminished so much as solidified into something he could work with. He was afraid that he would run out of time before the work was finished. He was 62 years old. His left knee was held together by scar tissue and stubbornness. His right shoulder, where a bullet had passed through the muscle in 1879 in New Mexico, ached in cold weather, and sometimes in heat that had no business making anything ache. He had outlived most of the men he had worked with at the Pinkertons, and several of the men who had tried to kill him, which he supposed said something about either his constitution or his luck, but he was no longer young enough to be certain which. He needed to move before Greer could consolidate his response. He needed the ledgers. He had known about the ledgers since Kansas, where a former bookkeeper named Odell Watts had talked to him for 3 hours in the back of a dry goods store in exchange for $20 and a promise that his name would not appear in any document Elias produced. Watts had worked for Harlan Moss for 4 years in Colorado before the arrangement became untenable. He had described a system of record-keeping that was meticulous in the way that criminal enterprises are sometimes meticulous, where everything is written down, precisely because when you are dealing with the kind of men who might one day need to be reminded of what they agreed to, written records are a form of leverage. Moss kept 3 ledgers, one for legitimate operations, one for the other kind, and one that Watts had only glimpsed once, which contained things he had declined to describe in specific terms but had suggested were enough to bring down not just the man himself but a network of officials and intermediaries that extended considerably beyond any one county or territory. Those ledgers would be in the safe at Iron Mesa. Along with Elias suspected whatever Robert Hale had written in his journal. The question was how to get to them with the resources available to one 62-year-old man and one 28-year-old widow. He was still working through the problem when at approximately 4 in the morning, a horse came up the road from the direction of town. Not moving fast, moving carefully in the manner of someone who did not particularly want to be heard. Elias was on his feet and in the shadow of the bunkhouse wall before the rider reached the gate. The man who dismounted was not young and was not well. He was perhaps 58, heavy-set in the way of men who had once been heavier and had lost weight recently through worry rather than effort, with a coat that was too warm for the season and the particular careful movements of someone managing pain he had been carrying long enough to learn the shape of. He stood at the gate and looked at the house and the bunkhouse, and did not call out, which suggested he was not entirely sure of his welcome. Elias stepped out of the shadow. The man saw him and went very still. "I'm looking for Elias Cord," he said. His voice was the voice of someone who had once been a careful, measured speaker and had recently lost the ability to maintain it. "You found him." The man exhaled a sound like something releasing that had been held under considerable pressure for a considerable length of time. "My name is Clem Prudhoe. I worked as a bookkeeper for Magnus Greer for 6 years. He paused. "Before that, I worked for Harlan Moss in Colorado." The name settled between them in the night air like something dropped from a height. "Come inside," Elias said. Ada was up by the time they reached the kitchen, dressed and alert in the way of someone who did not sleep deeply when things were uncertain, which was a sensible adaptation to her current circumstances. She put coffee on without being asked, and sat across the table from Prudhoe and listened with her hands folded and her expression giving nothing away, while the man gathered himself to speak. Prudhoe talked for an hour. He told them about the arrangement Greer had with the county sheriff, which involved a percentage of every land acquisition that went through Pike's office under legitimate-looking documentation. He told them about the judge in the next county over a man named Bertram Hoyle, who had been on Greer's informal payroll for 3 years. He told them about the system by which debt instruments were created against properties Greer wanted, instruments that gave him legal standing to foreclose when payments predictably failed. The failure made predictable by various means that Prudhoe described with the flat effect of a man who has spent years carefully not looking directly at the thing he is part of. And then he told them about Dalton Briggs. Briggs was a contractor in the particular sense that men who provide organized violence for payment call themselves contractors. He operated out of a base in the Wyoming Territory with a company of 25 men, all experienced, all carrying the specific kind of loyalty that is purchased and lasts exactly as long as the purchasing continues. Greer had used him twice before in New Mexico, and in the eastern part of Texas when a situation had reached the stage where the size of the response required exceeded what his regular men could reliably provide. He had sent for Briggs 3 days ago. Briggs and his men would be in the Willow Bend area in approximately 4 days, possibly 3 if they pushed hard. "He's done being patient," Prudhoe said, "after what happened with Vardell in town and whatever Vardell told him about you." He looked at Elias. "He's decided to close this out fast and completely. The ranch burns. You disappear." He looked at Ada and could not quite hold her eyes. "Mrs. Hale disappears too, and then there's no one left withstanding to contest the deed transfer." The kitchen was quiet. "Why are you telling us this?" Elias asked. Prudhoe put both hands flat on the table. They were a bookkeeper's hands, careful and ink-stained, not the hands of a man accustomed to situations involving burning ranches and women who disappear. They were trembling slightly, and he did not try to hide it. "Because I've been carrying something for 12 years, he said, "and I cannot carry it anymore." Elias went very still. Prudhoe did not look at him directly. He looked at the table, at his own hands on it, and he spoke in the measured way of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say many times and is still not certain he can reach the end of it. In the winter of 1875, he said he had been working as a bookkeeper for Harlan Moss's mining operation in Copper Ridge, Colorado. He had been 46 years old and established enough in that particular life to know what he stood to lose from it, and afraid enough of the man he worked for to know what happened to people who were on the wrong side of certain conversations. A young deputy named Jesse Cord had come asking questions about land transfers, and the questions had been good questions, thorough and precisely aimed. And Moss had known they were good questions because someone had told him. Prudhoe stopped. "You told him," Elias said. His voice had not changed. It was still level, still deliberate, the voice he used for everything. "I told him," Prudhoe said, "not for money. I want you to know that though I understand it changes nothing, I was afraid. Moss had made it clear to everyone in his employ what happened to people who were on the wrong side of certain conversations, and I made a choice that I have thought about every single day since the morning I made it." Elias did not move. Under the table, his right hand had come to rest on the grip of his gun, not drawing it, just resting there the way a hand will find a familiar thing when the mind is occupied with something it cannot otherwise manage. Ada's eyes moved to his hand and then to his face. She said nothing. She waited with the particular stillness of someone who understands that what happens in the next few seconds matters more than anything she might say. The silence stretched. Prudhoe looked up, finally looked at Elias directly with the expression of a man who has decided that looking away is no longer a thing he is entitled to do. "Jesse was dead by the next morning," he said. "I have known what I was part of for 12 years. I have been too afraid to do anything about it until now, when Greer is about to do to this woman and this valley what he has done everywhere else he has been, and I find that I cannot—" His voice frayed. He gathered it back. "I cannot be that man again. Not again." The silence after that was different from any that had come before it. Elias's hand was still on his gun. He could feel the weight of 12 years pressing against the inside of his chest with a specific, familiar pressure. He could feel the winter in Colorado, the frozen ground, the words he had said over the graves, because there was no one else to say them and they needed to be said properly, and had not been. He could feel the moment in Denver when they walked him out of the Pinkerton building, and the year after that, when he had not been certain that survival was something he intended to pursue. He could feel all of it, every compressed ounce of it. And he could see with the clarity that comes from decades of doing difficult work with incomplete information that killing Clem Prudhoe in Ada Hale's kitchen at 4 a.m. would end everything else. Would end the ledgers, would end any possibility of what Jesse had been working toward in Copper Ridge actually being finished in the way it deserved to be finished, with a trial and a record and a formal accounting in a federal courthouse. His hand moved away from the gun. He placed it flat on the table. "Tell me about the safe," he said. Something moved across Prudhoe's face that he did not yet have the right to show and seemed to know it. He composed himself with visible effort. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper which he spread on the table between them. It was a floor plan, hand-drawn but precise with the precision of a man who had spent years working with numbers and understood the relationship between accuracy and consequence. Iron Mesa's main house, room by room, with careful notations of dimensions and features. The study on the second floor, north-facing, with the safe built into the wall behind the painting of the mountain that Greer had brought with him from Colorado. A painting Prudhoe noted with a particular flatness of tone that depicted the valley above Copper Ridge. Elias looked at the floor plan for a long time without speaking. "The combination," he said finally. "I don't know it, but I know the make and the model year." He named it. A Herring Hall Marvin floor model, 1871 manufacture. Elias knew the line. He had opened 3 of them in his years at the Pinkertons, 2 in the course of legitimate investigations and 1 in circumstances he preferred not to elaborate on. The mechanisms were consistent within the model year, which was useful information. "Guards," he said. 4 on the perimeter at night, rotating in pairs. 2 at the main entrance, 1 at the barn, 1 at the north fence line. The study itself is not individually guarded because Greer believes the perimeter is sufficient and has believed this for 5 years without being challenged. Prudhoe paused. "There is a kitchen window on the west side of the house that has a broken latch. It has been broken for 2 years. I mentioned it 3 times during my employment. It was never repaired." Elias studied the floor plan. He traced the route from the kitchen window to the back staircase up to the second floor along the hall to the study. He measured distances in his mind against what he knew of his own pace in the dark. He looked at Ada. She was already looking at him with the expression of someone who has worked out where this is going and has already arrived there and is waiting for everyone else to catch up. "I'll go to Denver," she said. "Marshal Stokes." Everett Stokes was the federal marshal for the Denver district. A man Elias had worked alongside in 1871 and 1872, when their jurisdictions had briefly overlapped in a matter involving a counterfeiting operation in southern Colorado. He was thorough and honest and had not been bought as far as Elias had ever been able to determine, which in that part of the country at that period of time put him in a fairly small category. "He'll want more than testimony," Elias said. "He'll want the ledgers," Ada said. "He'll want the ledgers," Elias agreed. which is why you go to him with what Prudhoe can give in writing sworn and signed, and you tell him what I'm going to do, and you ask him to ride." He looked at her steadily. "It will take you 2 days to get there. 2 days back if he moves immediately. 4 days total. Briggs is expected in 3 to 4 days." "The margins are very small," she said. "They are," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise." Ada was quiet for a moment. She looked at the floor plan on the table. Then she looked at Prudhoe. "If you're lying," she said with the particular directness of a woman who has decided that indirection is a luxury she cannot afford, "if this is Greer's arrangement to get us separated and out of position, you should know that I will find a way to make that consequential for you." Prudhoe met her eyes without flinching. "I know," he said. "I'm not lying. I haven't got anything left worth protecting by lying." She nodded once. She looked at Elias. "Tomorrow night for you? I leave at first light." "Tomorrow night," he agreed. She pushed back from the table and went to write the letter that Prudhoe would sign, and Elias stayed at the table with the floor plan and his cooling coffee and the man who had been 46 years old and afraid, and had made a choice that he had spent 12 years paying for in the currency of sleepless nights and the particular ongoing tax that certain kinds of cowardice levy on the people who survive them. He did not forgive him that night. He was not capable of it yet, and would not pretend otherwise. But he also did not send him away. In the morning, he told Duff and Cornelius what was coming and positioned them in the places that would give the ranch the best defensible geometry available. He showed Prudhoe where to stand and what to do if things went wrong, and he spent the rest of the day memorizing the floor plan until he could draw every room from memory in the correct proportions, until the distances between the kitchen window and the study door were as familiar as the distances between the rooms of a house he had lived in. Ada left before dawn. He watched her ride south from the gate, the bay mare moving well in the cool morning air until the darkness absorbed her completely. He did not say anything beyond the practical things. She did not either. They were past the point where sentiment was something either of them had time to afford. He waited through the day. He worked on the ranch because there was work to do, and because stillness had never suited him, and because the two ranch hands and Prudhoe needed to see that the man they were following into whatever came next was not afraid, which he was not exactly, though he held a serious and considered respect for the possibility of things going wrong. He dug the positions he wanted along the fence lines and behind the water troughs, stored ammunition in 3 separate locations, walked the ground until he knew its angles and shadows the way he knew the floor plan of Iron Mesa. When the night was fully dark and the moon had set, he saddled Amos and rode east. Iron Mesa sat on a slight rise of ground that gave it visibility in all directions, a choice that reflected the mind of the man who had built it. The main house was large by the standards of the region, a 2-story timber and stone structure built to last and to impress, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals and the infrastructure of an operation that had grown faster than any honest enterprise had a right to. From a distance, it looked like success. At close range, it looked like what it was, a fortification built by a man who expected to need one. He left Amos in a dry creek bed 3/4 of a mile out and went the rest of the way on foot. His knee said what it always said. He gave it the consideration it deserved, which was acknowledgement and nothing more, and kept moving through the dark. He moved along the fence line, timed against the guard rotation, reached the west side of the house in the interval between the barn guard's eastward pass and the perimeter pair's southward circuit. The kitchen window was where Prudhoe had said it was. The broken latch was as described. He worked a thin piece of metal into the gap, with the patience of someone who has done this before, and knows that patience here is the difference between a door that opens and a door that does not. The window opened in 40 seconds. He was inside. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and rendered fat and faintly gun oil. Someone had cleaned weapons at this table recently, which he noted and filed. He stood in the kitchen for 90 seconds, learning the sounds of the house, separating the sounds that belonged to the building from those that did not. One person moving on the floor above him, the irregular footsteps of someone pacing rather than walking through not in the study. He moved to the hallway and went up the stairs. The study door was unlocked. Greer trusted his perimeter. Elias eased the door open, moved inside, closed it behind him. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper and the particular staleness of a space where a man spends time alone with his worst qualities. A large desk at the center, bookshelves on two walls. On the north wall, between the two windows, a painting of a mountain valley. Even in the darkness, Elias recognized it. The configuration of peaks above the Copper Ridge approach. The dark line of the creek below. The suggestion in the lower right corner of the canvas of a structure that had been a house and a barn and a working ranch until the winter of 1875. Greer had hung a painting of the place where Jesse was buried on the wall of his private study. Elias stood in front of it for a moment. He felt something move through him that was neither anger nor grief, but contained both, and resolved into something harder and colder and more purposeful than either. He moved the painting. The safe was where Prudhoe had said it was. He knelt in front of it, his right knee protesting this particular arrangement of his 62-year-old body, and put his ear against the door and his fingers on the dial. He worked by touch and by the faint vibrations that the mechanism transmitted through the steel, the near-silent language of tumblers, finding their positions, reading it with the sensitivity of fingers that had spent 27 years in work that required them to be more than merely functional. 4 minutes. Perhaps a few seconds more. The door swung open. He moved his hands through the contents with systematic efficiency. Ledgers, 3 of them exactly as Watts had described in Kansas, each one representing a different category of record. Documents. Correspondence bundled with twine. A deed registry that had no business being in a private safe. He transferred everything methodically into the leather satchel he had brought. And then his fingers found an envelope. It was tucked behind the 3rd ledger, not prominently placed, not hidden in any deliberate sense, simply there as though it had been put somewhere and not moved. In the darkness, he nearly set it aside with the other documents, but his fingers traced the letters on the front and his hand stopped. Jesse Cord. His son's name in handwriting he did not recognize on an envelope that had been sitting in Harlan Moss's safe for a number of years he could not immediately calculate, but that felt in the weight of the moment like all of them. He put the envelope inside his coat against his chest and closed the safe and replaced the painting with the same care he had used removing it. He moved back to the door. He went down the stairs. He was in the hallway 8 feet from the kitchen when the back staircase at the far end produced a guard he had not accounted for, a route Prudhoe had either not known or not thought to mention. The man appeared with a lamp in one hand and a shotgun in the other, and they saw each other at the same moment across 20 feet of dark hallway. Elias did not reach for his gun. A gunshot in that house at that hour would bring every man on the property down on him before he could reach the fence line. He needed a different answer. He stepped back into the shadow of the nearest doorway and picked up the first object his hand found, a brass candlestick from the hall table, and threw it at the window at the far end of the hall, past the guard, putting it through the glass with a crash that was startling in the quiet of the house. The guard spun toward the sound. Elias went through the kitchen in 8 steps and out the broken latched window and dropped into the dark yard outside and pressed himself against the wall and held absolutely still. Inside voices. The guard calling out. From somewhere on the property, a dog began barking at the wrong side of the fence. He moved along the west wall to the northwest corner, through the shadow of the woodpile, through the gap in the fence that Prudhoe had described, and out into the open ground beyond the property boundary. Then he was moving fast across the dark landscape toward the creek bed in Amos, and behind him the lights of Iron Mesa were coming on one by one. He reached Amos. Mounted. Rode west at an angle that kept the creek bed between him and Iron Mesa for the first mile, then turned north toward the ranch. He did not reach inside his coat for the envelope. He would not do that on horseback in the dark. He would wait until he had light and stillness. He had waited 12 years. He could wait another hour. He was 40 minutes from the ranch when Duff materialized from the darkness beside the north fence line. 3 riders came from the east, Duff said. An hour ago. They looked and went back. Scouts, Elias said. Get Cornelius. Get Prudhoe. Everyone to their positions now. They'll come before morning. Duff went without another word. Elias went to the bunkhouse and sat on the edge of the cot and took the envelope from inside his coat. He opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages written in the precise, upright hand of a young man who had taught himself to write as an adult and been proud of the discipline it required. He had seen that handwriting in 3 letters, each one carried in an oilskin in his saddlebag, across 12 years in 3 territories. He knew every characteristic of it. He read. Jesse had known he was in danger when he wrote this. The letter said so without evasion, in the manner of a young man who has decided that honesty is more useful than reassurance. He had found evidence of the ledgers. He had identified the pattern of land acquisitions across 2 counties. He had the names of 3 officials he believed were receiving payments from Moss. He had written it all down in the precise, organized way of someone who understood that this information needed to outlast the moment. And then at the bottom of the 2nd page, in the same careful hand, a paragraph that had nothing to do with evidence or land records. Jesse had written, "If you are reading this, Pa, there are 2 things I want you to know. The first is that I found something worth finding, and I believe you will finish it because you have always finished what you started, and I have never once in my life doubted that about you. The second is that I am not afraid. I know what I am doing, and I know why I am doing it, and that is enough. I am your son, and I hope I have done it justice." Elias sat on the edge of the cot in the bunkhouse of the Hale Ranch and read those words, and then read them again, and outside the night held a particular stillness, the insects and the wind and the distant cattle all pausing in the way that nights sometimes do when something that has been wrong for a long time is beginning at last to be set right. Then, from the direction of the main road came a sound that resolved as sounds do in the dark, from a formless rumble into something specific and purposeful, many hoofbeats, coming fast. Dalton Briggs had arrived a day ahead of schedule. Elias folded the letter with care, returned it to the envelope, placed the envelope inside his coat against his chest. He checked his gun. He picked up the satchel with the ledgers. He walked out of the bunkhouse and into the yard. 25 riders materialized from the dark at the property's edge and spread into a practiced encirclement that spoke of men who had done this particular work before and expected it to go the way it had always gone. Behind the lead riders, Elias could make out the shape of Tuck Vardell, and behind Vardell, the upright posture of a man who had not come to watch from a distance. Magnus Greer had come himself. Vardell pulled up at the gate. "Cord, this is finished." Elias stood in the yard with the satchel in his left hand and his right hand free at his side. "Greer," he said, directing his voice past Vardell, "I have your ledgers, all 3 of them." A pause. Then Greer moved his horse forward through the column until he was beside Vardell. Across the distance and the dark, Elias looked at the man who had killed his son and kept his fire where it had lived for 12 years, controlled and purposeful because he was going to need it to last a little longer. "You're one old man," Greer said. "I've been one old man for 12 years, Elias said. "You should have worried about that sooner." Greer raised his hand. The riders came through the gate. The first shot was Elias's, aimed at a torch one of the riders carried, which he hit cleanly, the torch dropping into the dirt and buying 8 seconds of confusion before the column reorganized. 8 seconds was enough to move to the first prepared position behind the water trough, which had 8 inches of solid wood on the near side and which Duff had filled to capacity the afternoon before, for reasons that now made complete practical sense. What followed was not a battle in any formal sense. It was a controlled retreat through a series of positions, each one bought and surrendered for minutes, each one exchanging ground for time. Duff was steady at the corral fence. Cornelius was steadier at the barn wall. Prudhoe held his assigned position without breaking, which surprised Elias less than it might have a day earlier. Elias moved between positions, making each shot count, because he did not have the luxury of shots that did not count. He thought about nothing except the geometry of what was in front of him and the time he was buying, and the road that ran south toward Denver, where Ada Hale was either riding fast or had arrived and was talking to a man who needed to move. The barn caught fire near the end. Someone reached the east wall with a torch, and the dry timber caught immediately and completely, and the light from it turned the yard into something that would have been remarkable under other circumstances. Elias was against the south wall of the main house when the bullet found his right shoulder. He felt it with the specific comprehensive communication of a wound that arrives in a part of the body you depend on, and he registered it and kept moving because the alternative was not acceptable. He went from the main house wall to the porch steps, firing with his right hand. And then as the shoulder began to fail, transferring the gun to his left and continuing each shot slower now and less certain, but none of them entirely wasted. Duff reached him near the porch. "There are too many of them," Duff said. "I know," Elias said. "Hold it anyway. Ada needs time." He reloaded as best he could and went back to the position he had chosen and continued the work of buying minutes with whatever he had left to spend, and from somewhere at the edge of his awareness, from the direction of the south road, he thought he heard something that might have been more horses coming fast. He thought Ada. He thought good. He thought, "Jesse, I've found the letter." Then the world tilted in a direction it had no business tilting, and the dark came up to meet him, and he let it come because he had done what he came to do and was going to have to trust that it was enough. He came back to the world the way a man comes back from somewhere very far away, not all at once. In pieces. First, the pain which arrived before anything else, the right shoulder announcing itself with the insistence of a wound that has been ignored longer than it intended to tolerate. Then sound voices, movement, the creak of floorboards, the distant pop and settle of something that had recently been on fire, cooling down through the night hours. Then light, the orange warm kind that comes from a lamp, turned low, the kind that is meant to be restful and is, if you are not the person lying beneath it, trying to remember where you are and how you arrived there. He opened his eyes. Ada Hale was sitting in the chair beside the bed. She was still in her riding clothes, dust-covered and worn through with hard miles, and she had her arms folded across her chest and her chin down in the manner of someone who has been awake a very long time and has refused as a matter of principle to stop. When he moved, she looked up immediately, and the expression on her face cycled through several things in quick succession before settling on something that was not quite relief and not quite anger, but shared a border with both. "The ledgers," he said. His voice came out thin and dry. "Safe," she said. "All three." He absorbed this. "Briggs." "In custody. 14 of his men with him, the rest scattered when the marshals came through the gate." She paused. "Duff counted what you did before you went down. He is a precise man." "And Cornelius." "A bruised rib from a fall behind the barn. He's been working on the fence line since dawn, which Doc Fenwick has opinions about." Elias attempted to sit up and received a comprehensive education in why that was not yet a reasonable aspiration. He settled for turning his head, which gave him the window dark. Outside, still or dark again, he could not immediately determine which. And the room, which was the small bedroom off the kitchen of the main house, the one Ada did not use herself, the one with the solid timber ceiling and the quilt at the foot of the bed. "How long?" he said. 36 hours. She said it the way people say things they have been counting every unit of. "Doc Fenwick has been here twice. He says the bullet passed through the muscle of the right shoulder without hitting bone, which he described as the best possible outcome given the circumstances. He also mentioned your knee." "My knee is fine. He said you would say that." And he disagreed, with considerable specificity. She looked at him steadily. "Greer is in the county jail. Stokes has him under federal hold, pending transfer to Denver. He's been asking to see you." The room was quiet for a moment. "I told Stokes you were unconscious," she said. "I did not tell him what your answer would be once you were not." Elias looked at the window. The darkness outside was beginning to thin at its very edges, the preliminary gray of approaching dawn. He had lost a full day and most of a night. Things had been decided and set in motion while he was absent from the proceedings, and he needed to understand what they were, Ada told him. She had arrived in Denver ahead of the 2-day estimate, having pushed the bay mare at a pace she had not told him she was planning. Marshal Everett Stokes had been in his office, which he had taken as a useful sign. She had spread Prudhow's signed statement and supporting documents across his desk, and given him the account of what Elias was doing at Iron Mesa and why. Stokes had listened without interrupting, which she had found either impressively disciplined or concerning, and she still was not entirely sure which. Then he had said in a voice that contained 12 years of compressed revision, "Elias Codd is alive." She had confirmed this. She had told him about the Pinkerton file and the hush money and the 12 years of following a trail that Stokes had apparently been watching from the edges of his own jurisdiction with incomplete information and no clean way to act on it. Stokes had stood up before she finished speaking and called for his deputies, 14 men. They had ridden through the night and into the following day and arrived at Hale Ranch to find the barn fully engaged, Briggs's column reorganizing from the first hour of unexpected resistance, and a man with a bullet in his right shoulder holding the south wall of the house with a pistol in his left hand, which Stokes had described to Ada with the expression of someone who does not know whether to be appalled or respectful and has settled on both simultaneously. Elias lay still for a while and let this account settle. He did not comment on the left-handed pistol, which had been a matter of necessity and which he suspected had been less accurate than he would have preferred. "Stokes wants to see you," Ada said. "When you're ready. He says there are things to arrange before the Denver proceedings." "Tomorrow," Elias said. "Doc Fenwick said a week." "Tomorrow," he said again. She looked at him for the length of time it takes to determine that an argument is not going to be productive. Then she stood. "The envelope," she said. "It was inside your coat when they brought you in." She reached into her pocket and held it across the bed. He could see Jesse's name on the front of it from where he lay. She set it on the bedside table and left him with it. He did not reach for it immediately. He lay still for a while and let the morning come. The sky through the window went from gray to pale gold to the hard, clear blue of a Texas summer morning, and from outside came the sound of hammers, the sound of men working with purpose. He lay and listened to it, and then he reached for the envelope. He read the letter again in the morning light, more slowly than he had read it in the bunkhouse, with the sound of Briggs's column on the road. He read the evidence Jesse had compiled, precise and well-ordered, as everything Jesse had ever produced. He read the final paragraph and read it again, and then he folded the letter carefully along its creases and held it in his hands for a while. He was still holding it when Marshal Everett Stokes knocked on the doorframe. Stokes was a tall man, angular in the way of men who have been lean their whole lives, with a gray mustache, and the eyes of a man who has spent decades watching people decide whether to tell him the truth and has become very good at knowing the moment of the decision. He sat in the chair Ada had vacated and looked at Elias without the preliminary of social niceties which was appropriate between men of their history. "You look terrible," Stokes said. "You look older," Elias said. "Both true." Stokes looked at the envelope. "Is that what I think it is?" "Jesse wrote it the night before he died. Greer kept it." He paused. "I haven't worked out why he kept it entirely. Insurance, perhaps. Something to hold over me if I ever got close enough to matter. Or something else." He looked at the envelope in his hands. "He's not a simple man." "No," Stokes said. "He isn't." He reached into his coat and produced a document folded in thirds, which he set on the bed without ceremony. "Our people went through the ledgers last night. All 3 of them. It's larger than you knew, Elias. 12 land acquisitions across 4 territories. 9 deaths ruled accidental that were not. 4 sitting officials taking structured payments, including a federal customs examiner in El Paso. And the Pinkerton connection, 3 names with payment amounts and dates going back to 1875. I knew there were names. I didn't know how many. 3. 1 still with the organization. 1 retired in 1881. 1 deceased." He looked at Elias carefully. "This is going to be a significant proceeding. Denver first, then almost certainly further. It won't move quickly." "I'm not going anywhere," Elias said. Stokes studied him for a moment. "Greer is asking to speak with you privately before the transfer. His lawyers are advising against it. He's insisting on it." A pause. "My recommendation is that you decline." "I'll think about it," Elias said. Stokes picked up his hat. For what it's worth, what you built over 12 years, the trail you followed when everyone else had closed the file. It's the foundation of the entire case. Without it, we have Prudhow's testimony and some documents. With it, we have a complete record. He stood. Jesse's work and yours, both of them together. He left. Elias lay still for a while after that. Then he got up. He dressed with the deliberate strategy of a man for whom dressing has temporarily become a problem, requiring solutions. The right shoulder was bandaged in an arrangement that Doc Fenwick had clearly designed, with the expectation that his instructions would be ignored, making ignoring them as inconvenient as possible. Elias worked around it, put on his coat, put on his hat, and went outside. Duff was at the corral gate, checking the fence line with the methodical attention of a man who has decided that the most sensible response to surviving a difficult night is to ensure the next one is better prepared. He looked up when Elias came out, nodded once, and returned to the fence. Cornelius was visible at the far end of the pasture, with the cattle moving at the unhurried pace of a man who had been told by a doctor to rest and had interpreted this as permission to work at a slightly reduced tempo. Both of them were here and working, and that was what they were, and what they would be, and that was enough. Rupert Gann was at the debris pile where the barn had been working alongside two men. Elias did not recognize pulling burned timber with the careful movements of someone who knows he is not as strong as he was, but intends to contribute the strength he has. When he saw Elias, he stopped and walked over with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a man who has been composing something and is not confident it will survive contact with the person it is meant for. "I want to say something," Gann said. Elias waited. "I stood there," Gann said, "in my own store, while Vardel had her by the wrist and I held the counter and I didn't move." He looked down at his hat. 30 years in this town, and I stood there. "You're here now," Elias said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Elias said. "It isn't." He looked at the old man steadily. "But the town is still standing. The ranch is still standing. There are proceedings coming that will need people willing to say plainly what they saw and what they knew. That's the remaining work." He paused. "Courage doesn't always arrive when it's needed. Sometimes it's late. That doesn't make it worthless." Elias watched Gann go back to the debris pile and return to the work of pulling burned timber with the methodical care of someone who understands that the work itself is the apology and the apology needs to be done properly. That afternoon, against Doc Fenwick's formally registered objections, Elias rode to town. The county jail was a stone building 2 blocks off the main street, solid and without ornament, with Stokes's deputies at the door and inside. Greer was in the back cell, which had a window facing the alley and a cot facing the wall. And he was sitting on the cot when the deputy let Elias in. 12 years. He had seen Greer at a distance twice in those 12 years, both times too brief and too far for anything of use. He had not been in the same room with this man since the winter of 1875, when he had sat across a desk in the Copper Ridge Sheriff's office and listened to Harlan Moss say with a credible expression of sympathy that he had no idea what could have happened to Deputy Jesse Cord, and that it was a terrible loss, and that he would do everything he could to assist the investigation. Moss had been a good liar. Greer was a different iteration of the same man, older, more settled in his certainty, with the particular assurance of someone who has been untouchable for a long time and has made the mistake of believing that untouchable and invulnerable are the same thing. Behind the assurance, something had changed. Something that Elias had seen before in men who have finally been caught, who have spent their entire lives certain they were smarter than the consequences and have been proved wrong. "Cord," Greer said. Greer. Elias did not sit. He stood near the cell door with his coat and his hat and his right arm in its sling and looked at the man who had killed his son. "You wanted to see me." "I wanted to see if you looked like what you cost me," Greer said. The composure was maintained through visible effort. 12 years, 3 territories, considerable resources directed at managing the problem of you. "Not enough," Elias said. Greer looked at him. The silence between them contained all 12 years folded into it. "I'm going to tell you something," Greer said. "My lawyers have advised against it. I'm telling you anyway because I have been in this cell for 2 days with nothing to do but think about what a man is owed before the account closes." He looked at his own hands, a gesture Elias had seen before in men reaching the end of their particular story. Jesse Cord had a woman before he died. Her name was Nora Whitfield. She taught school in Copper Ridge. They had an understanding, as people called it. She was carrying his child when he died. She did not know it yet herself. The cell was very quiet. I found out 6 months later. Greer continued in the level voice of a man giving a report he has decided to give completely, through the same channels that informed me of most things. A woman in Copper Ridge with a child coming and no husband, and a name connected to a dead deputy who had been asking inconvenient questions. His voice did not change. I had her watched for 11 years, not to harm her. I am not offering this as a virtue. I understand what it is and what it says about how I operated. I had her watched because she was leverage. If you ever got close enough to be a problem that couldn't be managed any other way, she was the card I held. He looked up. She moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1879. She teaches school there still. The boy's name is Thomas. He's 11 years old. Elias stood very still. "I'm telling you this," Greer said, "because I am going to hang. I know the contents of those ledgers, and I know what Prudhoe will say. And I know what the letter says. And I know I'm going to hang. The only thing I have left that is worth anything to anyone is the information that your son's son exists and does not know his grandfather is alive." He met Elias's eyes for the first time since he had begun speaking. "That is not an apology. I'm not going to insult you with one. It is the last honest thing I have." The silence afterward had a different quality from any silence in the room before it. Elias looked at Magnus Greer for a long moment. He thought about Jesse at 24, broad-shouldered and serious, riding out of Denver toward Copper Ridge in the autumn of 1875. He thought about a woman named Nora Whitfield teaching school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with a boy of 11 who had his father's eyes by the account of a man who had been watching them as a precaution. He thought about what Jesse had written at the bottom of the second page of the letter. He looked at Greer. "You just gave me a reason to live longer than you," he said. He turned and walked out of the cell block and into the afternoon light of Willow Bend, Texas, and stood on the steps of the county jail and breathed the hot summer air and let it be what it was, which was ordinary air on an ordinary afternoon in a town that was beginning cautiously and with some uncertainty to remember what ordinary felt like. Clem Prudhoe was waiting on the bench along the jail wall. He had been sitting there with his hat on his knees and his hands folded, occupying space with the careful quietness of a man who has learned not to assume his presence anywhere is welcome. When Elias came out, he looked up and then looked at the ground, the reflex of someone who has spent a long time not being sure he deserved to be looked at directly. Elias sat down on the bench beside him. They sat without speaking for a while. The main street of Willow Bend moved past them at its afternoon pace, which was unhurried in the way of a place that is beginning to exhale after holding its breath for 5 years. Finally, Prudhoe said, "I know it doesn't change what I did." "No," Elias said, "it doesn't. I told myself it was the circumstances, that I was afraid. I have been telling myself that for 12 years as though it explains the thing." "It doesn't explain it," Elias said. "But it's true, and true things have their place." He looked at the street. "I've done things I'm not proud of. Most of them were done by a younger version of me who believed he was running out of options, and some of the things he did were necessary. And some of them were not, and I have had to learn to hold both of those facts at the same time." He paused. "You came forward. You signed the statement. You stayed at your position when you had every opportunity and arguably every reason to run." He was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't cancel what you did. Nothing cancels it. But it is what you did next, and next is the only direction that remains available to either of us." Prudhoe sat with this for a long time. "What will you do?" he said eventually. "After Denver. Come back here for a while. There's winter preparation to do on the ranch." Elias looked out at the street. "And then I'm going to take a trip to New Mexico, Santa Fe." Prudhoe looked at him. "I have a grandson," Elias said. "Apparently." The trial convened in Denver on a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks after the night at Hale Ranch. Elias rode up with Ada and Stokes and a contingent of deputies that Stokes considered minimal and Elias considered more than adequate, and they arrived the evening before proceedings began to find the city in the particular state of alert attention that accompanies a trial whose implications extend beyond the immediate jurisdiction. The federal courthouse was a solid stone building near the center of Denver built to project permanence, which was either an aspiration or an observation depending on how you felt about institutions at any given moment. Elias had felt variably about them over the course of his life and had arrived in his 63rd year at something like a provisional respect for the ones that worked. The proceedings took 4 days. Prudhoe testified first and at length with the precision of a man who has spent his career working with numbers and understands that precision is the thing that makes testimony useful and that usefulness is the thing that makes testimony worth the cost of giving it. He was on the stand for most of the first day. When Greer's lawyer attempted to use Prudhoe's history of complicity to undermine his credibility, Prudhoe said, "I received those payments and I'm telling you what I know. These facts do not contradict each other. They are simply both true." Elias thought he did well. He testified himself on the 3rd day. He sat in the witness chair with his right arm still slightly constrained by the shoulder's ongoing recovery and his back straight against the chair, and he answered every question in the deliberate way of a man for whom testimony has long since become something he knows how to do rather than something that costs him to do. He kept to the useful, which was the evidence as he had gathered it over 12 years, and the facts as they existed in the documents and the record. When Greer's lawyer said, "Mr. Cord, you've spent 12 years in what some might characterize as a personal vendetta across 3 territories," Elias said, "I've been investigating for 12 years. The investigation produced 3 complete ledgers, a signed witness statement, documentary evidence of payments to 4 officials, and 3 Pinkerton agents, and accounting for 9 deaths that were incorrectly ruled accidental. That is what 12 years of investigating looks like when it's done properly." The courtroom absorbed this. The letter was read on the 4th day. Stokes had confirmed his intention the night before. Elias had said yes. He had sat in the small hotel room near the courthouse and held the envelope and been certain in the specific way you are certain about things that are going to cost you something real and are worth it anyway. The court clerk read it in the careful, neutral voice of a man who understands his function and fulfills it without editorializing. He read Jesse's account of the investigation, the names and dates and pattern of acquisitions, all of it, exactly as Jesse had observed and recorded in the last hours before someone came to make sure he would not observe or record anything further. And then he read the final paragraph in the same level professional voice, and the words moved through the courtroom and did what they did. The room was silent when he finished, not the silence of inattention, the silence of people sitting with something. Greer was convicted on 14 counts. The jury required less than 2 hours. The sentence was death. Sheriff Lyle Pike was arrested before the week was out. The accounting of what Greer had built over 15 years across 4 territories would take 2 more years to fully resolve, and Elias would be present for some of it and absent for some of it. And Jesse's letter entered into the federal record would be referenced in findings that outlasted everyone in that courtroom. He did not watch Greer's face when the sentence was read. He looked at the window, at the rectangle of September sky above the street, the hard, clear blue of Colorado autumn, unchanged from the winter of 1875 and every day in between. He thought about Jesse. He thought, it's done. They rode back to Willow Bend the following week. The new barn was finished, built by the people of the town over the 6 weeks they had been in Denver timber, and effort contributed without being asked, which was its own kind of verdict on what the community had decided it wanted to be going forward. It was a better barn than the original, by the assessment of anyone who looked at it, which Duff confirmed with the precision he brought to everything, and Cornelius confirmed by immediately storing things in it. Elias stood in the yard in the early evening light and looked at what had been done while he was away. Ada came to stand beside him. She had her coat on against the first coolness of the coming season, and she was looking at the new barn with an expression that was quieter and more complicated than simple satisfaction. She had held this land against pressure that would have ended most people, and she had held it, and she was going to continue holding it, and the valley was going to be different now in the ways that matter, when the thing that has been wrong for a long time is no longer wrong. "You should stay," she said. "For the winter, there's enough work. There's always enough work." "That's not a no." "It's not a no," he agreed. That evening after supper, when the dishes were cleared and the lamp burned low, and the night sounds of the ranch were the only sounds in the kitchen, Elias sat at the table with a sheet of paper and a pen. He sat with them before he wrote anything. He was thinking about what to say to a woman he had never met, who had lost Jesse 11 years ago and raised his son alone in Santa Fe, and who did not know that the man who had spent those 11 years pursuing what happened to the boy's father was alive and sitting in Texas with a working pen and something he needed to say. There was no perfect arrangement of words for this. He had learned in 62 years that the search for the perfect arrangement of words is often what keeps people from saying the necessary ones. He wrote, "My name is Elias Cord. I was Jesse's father. I did not know about you or the boy until recently, and I am sorry for that. Sorry that it took so long, and sorry for the years that passed without anyone telling you what Jesse was doing and why it mattered, and that it was finished the right way in the end. He was a good man. He was the best thing I ever had a hand in making, and I know you know that already. I am not asking for anything. I am 62 years old, and I intend to remain at Hale Ranch, Willow Bend, Texas for the foreseeable future. If you ever want to find me, I will be here. Tell the boy what you think is right to tell him in whatever time seems right to tell it. There is no hurry. I have learned recently that there is time enough for most things if you stop spending it on what cannot be changed." He folded the letter along careful lines and addressed the envelope in his own handwriting, Whitfield, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and set it on the table in front of him. Ada had appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had 2 cups of coffee, and she held one out without speaking. He took it. She sat across the table from him, and they drank in the quiet that had developed between them, the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled, because the people in it have been through enough together that silence is simply another form of the same conversation. Outside, the September wind moved across the plain with the first real coolness of the coming season in it. The lamp on the table burned steadily. The new barn stood solid in the dark, smelling of fresh timber and recent work. And from the pasture came the quiet sounds of cattle settled for the night, and the creek ran along the southern boundary, the way it had run for longer than either of them had been alive, and the windmill turned cleanly. Now the wobble repaired steady in the evening wind. Elias put his hand around the coffee cup and felt the warmth of it. He was 62 years old. He had a bullet wound that was mending, and a knee that had its established opinions, and a letter on the table addressed to a woman in New Mexico who did not know he existed. He had, for the first time in 12 years, no particular place he needed to be in the morning beyond here. No trail to follow, no man to find, no case to construct from whatever evidence could be gathered from the places careful men leave marks they think no one will find. He had instead a ranch that needed winter preparation, and 2 ranch hands who had earned considerably more than they were being paid, and a woman across the table who had held her ground against odds that would have ended most people, and somewhere in New Mexico a boy of 11 who had his father's eyes and did not yet know that his grandfather was sitting in Texas thinking about the future in a way he had not permitted himself to think about it for 12 years. He thought about Jesse. He did this now with less of the old desperate urgency, less of the quality that had made thinking about Jesse feel like touching something that could not be touched without cost. The grief was still present and would always be present, had worked itself into him the way healed bone is denser at the break than anywhere else. Stronger there than it was before the breaking, even though the break was real and had been real and would always have been real. But what he felt when he thought about Jesse now was not only loss. It was also pride, which was something he had not expected to recover the full capacity for. And something else that he was still finding the right word for, something that had to do with continuation, with the way things go on past the point where we expect them to stop, past the point where the evidence seems to suggest they cannot. Jesse had written, I always knew you would find him, Pa. He had found him. The rest of it was in motion and would continue without him, the way rivers continue without the stone that finally redirects them. He had done what he came to do. He had done what Jesse had been doing when they stopped him, and he had done it the way Jesse would have wanted it done, with evidence and a federal courtroom and a record that would be cited in findings that neither of them would live to see concluded. That was enough. It was more than enough, Ada said quietly. What did you put in the letter? The truth, he said, the parts of it that matter to someone who doesn't know any of it yet. Do you think she'll write back? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I think she will, he said. Jesse chose the people around him the way he did everything else, carefully and with good judgment. He looked at the envelope on the table. And I think the boy will want to know where he came from. Children usually do when they're given the chance. Ada held her cup in both hands and looked at the envelope and then out at the dark window. It would be something, she said quietly. A boy. Here. It would be something, he agreed. Outside, the night was vast and full of stars, the same stars that had been there on every night of his life over Indiana and Colorado and Kansas and New Mexico and Texas, over all the good nights and the terrible ones, over the night Jesse was born and the night his wife Margaret died and the night in 1875 when he had stood over frozen ground with inadequate words and made a promise to himself about what he was going to do next. He had done it. He picked up the coffee cup and drank what was in it while it was still warm, which was a thing he had not always remembered to do and was going to try to remember going forward, and he looked at the letter on the table and the lamp burning beside it and the woman across from him who had held her land and held her ground and was going to keep doing both. And he thought about a boy in Santa Fe, New Mexico, 11 years old, who would receive a letter from a grandfather he did not know existed and would have to decide what to do with that information. He thought the boy would decide well. He was Jesse's son. 12 years ago, Elias Cord had lost his son and had become by degrees something less than a man with a future, a man with a purpose, which is not the same thing, which is in fact the thing you become when the future closes down to a single task and the task becomes everything. He had ridden through 3 territories as a man who was present in body and elsewhere in every sense that mattered, carrying 12 years of grief and 12 years of patience and 1 remaining obligation that he had intended to fulfill, or to be attempting to fulfill when he died, whichever came first. Then one summer morning in Willow Bend, Texas, he had walked into a general store, seen a woman who needed help, and said 5 words. 5 words that did not just save her. They gave him back the thing he had stopped believing he would find again, which was a reason to think about what came next. He was thinking about it now. He was going to keep thinking about it. The lamp burned on the table. The letter sat beside it, addressed and ready, waiting for morning and the post rider who came through Willow Bend on Tuesdays. Outside the window, the new barn stood against the dock, and the windmill turned steadily in the September wind, and the creek ran along the southern boundary with the patient certainty of water that has always been here and intends to continue, and Elias Cord sat in a warm kitchen at the end of the longest 12 years of his life and drank his coffee while it was still worth drinking and thought about tomorrow.